Here. I've busted out an old tape recorder I found in my uncle's attic, and I'm ready to get real sad because today we're going to be talking about one of the best and saddest Spider-Man stories around, Spider-Man Blue, written by Jeph Loeb with art by Tim Sale. So Spider-Man Blue is a 6-issue series that lasts from 2002 to 2003, and it's one of the 4 colored series that Loeb and Sale did under the Marvel Knights imprint. The point of these colored series was to look at a specific pivotal moment in a character's life and then take a look at how that moment impacted them later on. So for Spider-Man, there's no moment in his history more impactful than the night Gwen Stacy died, which was a story written by Jerry Conway in Amazing Spider-Man 121 and 122. This story saw Norman Osborn as the Green Goblin, who was in full knowledge at the time of Peter Parker's secret identity as Spider-Man, kidnapping Gwen Stacy, who was then the love of Spider-Man's life, and taking her up to the top of the Brooklyn Bridge. As he battled Spider-Man, Norman threw Gwen off the edge, and then forcing Spider-Man to go try to save her. In the attempt, he accidentally snapped her neck, which killed Gwen Stacy. So not only was this hugely impactful for Spider-Man and Peter Parker, it was also really important for Mary Jane because it kind of pushed this party girl, more immature girl opposite of Gwen, to becoming more mature. And Peter really needed somebody he could open up to, and Mary Jane was that person. And so Gwen's death was kind of the catalyst for them getting together. And as we start Spider-Man Blue, Spider-Man is married to Mary Jane, but recording a message to Gwen on Valentine's Day in the dark, alone in his attic, about how much he misses Gwen and how much her life and death impacted him. So Peter Parker is feeling incredibly blue right now. And even though Valentine's Day is supposed to be this day you spend with your loved ones and it's a celebration of love, Peter's kind of doing that, but with Gwen instead of Mary Jane. And every single panel that Sale draws ends up awash in this deep blue tone that represents the sadness and loneliness that Peter's feeling. And Steve Buccelato's coloring is perfect in this book, and none of it will work without the colors really enforcing the melancholy that Spider-Man's feeling, but also the vibrancy that Buccelato's blonde coloring gives to Gwen, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So obviously, as you'd expect, the major theme of this book is loss, but it's not actually just about loss of life. It's also about the loss of time in Peter's case, because he heartbreakingly laments everything he missed while being Spider-Man. The moments he didn't get to spend with Gwen because he was off saving people or fighting people, and the things he missed and the things he wished he would have done. Peter really thought he was going to have more time with Gwen, and he ended up not, and that's very, very sad and tragic. And not only is it the loss of time and loss of life, it's also the loss of innocence for Mary Jane, who, after Gwen's death, was kind of woken up to the fact that life is going to end and she needs to do something more meaningful with it than she was doing. So the 6 issues of Spider-Man Blue actually recount and recontextualize the events of The Amazing Spider-Man 40 through 48, and we see Peter fight a veritable who's who of his villains, each of whom symbolically represent what he's feeling in each issue. So because each issue is really important to understanding the whole story, and there's a lot I want to talk about, and because nobody can stop me, we're going to go through each issue starting with number 1. It'll be brief. So in the first issue, Peter is already awash in blue in these opening moments. This blue that Buccellato puts into these panels is inescapable. It's everywhere. These are joyous, supposedly normally in any other Spider-Man book, joyous shots of Peter swinging through the city, but it's just blue. All these memories have become tainted by Gwen's death, and that is something that I absolutely love because the blue permeates out to everything, and it almost blinds you to the background. The edges are dulled, there's not a lot to see, everything is just blue because that's all there is, because that's all Peter's feelings, and this is his memories of that time. So you can't have a story about the death of Gwen Stacy without Norman Osborn showing up. So in the very first issue, Peter is fighting the Green Goblin, and then the Green Goblin gets caught in an explosion, and Peter begins to talk about how badly he wishes that Norman had just died then and there. And that's very un-Spider-Man-like, because Spider-Man is a hero who'd rather save his villains than fight them. But, with all the death and havoc that the Green Goblin was going to eventually wreak upon Spider-Man and his life and his friends, you can see why he's feeling that way. And then in the middle of this issue, we actually get the first time Peter meets Gwen and how she stuck out to him. And we get this perfect visual representation of what Gwen means to Peter right off the bat. Because in the sea of blue, we get this beautiful, striking blonde color from Buccellato in Gwen's hair. And it draws your eye immediately because you've been seeing blue, 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 striking blonde. And it takes all your attention. And that's how Peter's feeling. All of his attention is now put on Gwen as he's seeing her for the first time. And that's such a smart, great decision. But then Peter makes a terrible decision because he takes Gwen for a ride on his motorcycle and does not give her a helmet. Spider-Man does not care about head health, and he's possibly a menace, just like J. Jonah Jameson has been trying to warn us all along. MJ also shows up for a quick cameo at the end of issue number 1. She knocks on Peter's door while he's out, and Loeb already has her characterization down just in that one panel right there. She's already every bit the firecracker we'd come to expect, and she's every bit the party person we see back in those early 60s comics. So from there we move on to issue number 2. And it's here where the villains start to become symbolic of what Peter is feeling. And it's also where Loeb starts to distinguish between how MJ and Gwen affect Peter's life, not only as Peter Parker, but also as Spider-Man. It's also amazing how well Loeb captures the spirit and tone of those early 60s comics. This is the first time that we get the whole gang together with Gwen and Harry and Flash and Peter. And it's so fun and funny to watch them. Their banner is spot on. Loeb perfectly captures the spirit of those comics, and you just want to hang out with these really interesting people who would go on to live the worst lives anybody's ever lived. So Gwen is in the science lab, and Peter is there too, and Peter would go on to fight the Rhino, and Gwen actually gives Peter a bit of advice about a chemical reaction that Peter then uses to knock the suit off the Rhino, and he's able to knock the Rhino out and stop him. And this is really interesting because Loeb is kind of showing how Gwen helps Peter in a science capacity, and kind of she's this more cerebral character compared to what he'll show us with Mary Jane in a minute, which isn't better or worse, it's just different. And I love the use of Rhino as the villain in issue number 2 because Peter has now started thinking about Gwen and he can't stop. So just like the Rhino, the thoughts of Gwen are in his head, running around, running into every single thing. And it's such a smart move. It's a great visual representation of what Peter's feeling again. And also in this issue, we get Kraven the Hunter, who is this shadowy figure looming in the background. And Kraven kind of acts as this specter of death kind of looming over this whole story. And it really taints all the interactions that it reminds you that Gwen's going to die here. Kraven is kind of representing that death looming over Gwen and Peter and the death of their love and everything else. And it taints every interaction that Peter and Gwen have because no matter how happy those moments are, you know what's coming. And it's really impactful and sad. And then right at the end of that issue, number 2, we actually get a full debut of Mary Jane, and she crashes the study date that Peter was going to go on with Gwen and the rest of the gang. So in issue number 3, we start off with that study date. And we start to see that MJ is such a great foil to Gwen, who's obviously more buttoned up, and MJ is so much more happy-go-lucky and running around and all these things. But then the lizard strikes, and Peter has to take MJ with her, and we see immediately that he's leaving Gwen behind, and he's missing this moment, and Loeb really hammers that home later. But Peter brings MJ along, and MJ distracts a guard using her charms, so Peter can sneak down into the subway and fight the lizard. And Loeb's kind of showing us, well, this is something that MJ could do that Gwen probably couldn't, and this is a difference between them. And now Peter kind of has to choose which one of those kind of aspects that he's going to like more, because initially MJ's kind of abrasive, happy-go-lucky style pushed him to like Gwen more. But then after seeing this, Peter realized, well, that's kind of good too. So now he's kind of going back and forth and trying to figure out, well, who am I going to fall in love with? Because early Spider-Man comics were soap operas, plain and simple. So then in issue number 4, Loeb introduces a new Vulture who becomes important later, and he also reinforces how much Peter has to miss when he's Spider-Man, because as he's swinging to his own housewarming party, where all his friends, Gwen included, will be, the Vulture cuts his webbing short and forces him into a confrontation that ends with Peter nearly dead on his snowy rooftop. But instead of fearing for his life or anything else, all Peter can think about is Gwen and what Gwen thinks about him missing this party. And that's really sad, and it also goes to show you how much Peter misses when he's Spider-Man. He swings right by a party. He can see the party and they can see Spider-Man, but he can't enter it as Peter Parker because he's being Spider-Man. So this actually ends up being an okay thing for Peter to have happen because he gets sick, he catches a fever, but then Mary Jane and Gwen attend him by his bedside, and that is fantastic for him. But how they do it, how they attend to Peter, actually is another really good representation of how Loeb distinguishes MJ from Gwen and gives Peter these choices. So Mary Jane comes first and she brings Peter, who's in bed, lying in bed sick, this soup. But she specifically goes on to mention that she did not make it. And I think that this is Loeb having Mary Jane give this kind of layer of separation between who she really is and Peter and the outside world. And then Gwen comes in and reads Peter Huck Finn from a book, as one does, which is something that Aunt May told Gwen that Uncle Ben used to do for Peter. So as a contrast between Mary Jane's kind of a little less personal touch, Gwen comes in with this incredibly personal, touching thing that she would do for Peter, and it swings Peter closer to MJ or Gwen's side. But yeah, just the dichotomy between the two is so smart. And again, it's not. Peter then goes out and he sees the two vultures fighting, and he knows he has to go be Spider-Man. And he talks about the fact that essentially those two are it's MJ and Gwen fighting in his head over who he should marry, and it's basically him fighting himself to try to figure out which one of the two he's going to marry. And I love that Loeb never actually pits MJ and Gwen against each other. There's no petty cat fights, because that doesn't fit the tone of the book, and it's not what the book is trying to do. So I'm really happy that he kind of avoids doing that, because I think a lesser storyteller would have done that. I'm a lesser storyteller. I would have done that. And then at the end of that issue, Kraven is back as that specter of death. So after we get that really nice moment where Gwen goes to read to Peter at bed, we see Kraven again, covered in shadows. It's death coming for the two of them. And right at the beginning of, right at the end of issue number 5, Peter talks about how he thought he was going to have to choose between Gwen and MJ, but life made the choice for him. And that's so disappointing, and it's so depressing, because Peter really wanted to spend the rest of his life with Gwen, and he chose Gwen, and then life took that choice away from him. And that's something that happens to people every day, and a lot of people can relate to that, and it's very disappointing. And it's very effective, I'd say. And then right in the finale in issue number 6, Kraven finally pops in, and Peter is forced once again to save Norman Osborn's life. And we see that after he defeats Kraven, that Norman is starting to regain some of these memories, and we know exactly where that's going to lead. And in a nutshell, that's exactly the worst and best aspect of Spider-Man right there. Because of that responsibility, he's unable to do anything but help, even though he knows that this is going to lead to something terrible. And then after that, Spider-Man is undressing, and Gwen comes in, and Gwen sees that he has like a 24-pack for abs, and asks him in a very beautiful moment to be her Valentine. And it's very sweet, and the blues have kind of faded away. It's more black and white than anything else, and it's such a beautiful moment. And then after that, we hard cut back to Peter in the attic alone in the shadows on Valentine's Day, talking to a dead woman, or talking about a dead woman. And it's so effective, and it's sad, and it made me very sad reading this. And I'm happy nobody was here, because I did shed a tear while I was alone. So after they get that kiss, we're back, and it's just real life hits you in the face there. Real life hits Peter in the face. And everything's just so blue. And that's until MJ walks in. MJ walks into the attic and brings a bit more of that life back. It kind of beats back some of the shadows. She's in the light, even though Peter's in the shadows. So she's representative of that light kind of coming back into Peter's life there. And we see the maturity that MJ now has, because instead of getting jealous of Peter talking to and about a past love, she simply says, say hi to my friend for me, and then they move on in a really nice moment. I know that moment is incredibly popular, and it's really well done, and really well earned too, I think, because Loeb kind of does show the maturity that MJ has grown on throughout this series. It's a very quick 6-issue series, and MJ is by no means the focus, but she gets a lot of growth. So this moment is entirely earned, and it's also really well received. And she's not mad at Peter for any of his talk. And Peter the whole time has been talking about the fact that bad has to come after good. So he believes in that wholly, and that's why he's Spider-Man, and that's kind of how he gets through his days. And that happens with him after MJ's death, which is arguably the worst thing that could ever happen to Peter outside of Aunt May dying. That's the baddest bad. And then he gets the goodest good in getting to marry MJ, because that Gwen's death really pushed that pairing to happen and was the catalyst for that happening. So despite the fact that, something absolutely terrible happened, something good did come out of it, even if it took way longer than Peter would like. So Spider-Man Blue features some amazing old school Spidey action, to summarize, perfectly captured by sales panels that drip with nostalgia to this earlier era of Spider-Man comics, this early Stan Lee, Steve Ditko period back in the 60s. And Loeb's script does a fantastic job of showcasing Peter's emotions throughout the series. But also, in addition to that, Loeb does an awesome job of this characterization of this early 60s Spider-Man, who was a lot dorkier, a lot nerdier, and a lot more woe is me than the Spider-Man we know today. And he does an amazing job with the dialogue between the group. Everybody feels like themselves. He really captures the spirit and the tone of those earlier comics. But it's Buccellato's colors steal the show and hammer home the emotion that's at the core of Spider-Man Blue and what Gwen Stacy really meant for Peter. And the ending just shows you that no matter how bad things get, things will always get better, even if it takes a lot longer than you'd hoped. So I think that Spider-Man Blue is a perfect Spider-Man story that's enjoyable on so many levels, with the action, the humor, and the emotions all really hitting home. And it also gives you a deeper appreciation into one of the biggest people in Spider-Man's life. We've seen a lot about Gwen Stacy, but we haven't seen anything quite like this before, and Spider-Man Blue is the perfect encapsulation of what Gwen Stacy meant, but also what this moment meant, her death, what her death meant to Spider-Man later on. So it's just a really well done comic, and if you haven't read it, I absolutely suggest that you do. And if you have read it, what'd you think of it? Feel free to let me know.